They called him the Merry Monarch, a king of pleasure, of mistresses, of laughter that echoed through a palace built on scandal. He married a queen for an empire, and then spent a lifetime pretending she wasn't there.
We must assume she does.
While the court watched his parade of lovers, they watched her, and saw only a silent, barren failure. This is the story of King Charles II and Catherine of Braganza.
History is remembered in the light and forged in the shadows. I'm Arthur. Here, we use AI to journey beyond the record, to resurrect the whispers and witness what was meant to stay buried. Welcome to Shadow History.
A story that begins as a cold transaction and ends in a hushed death chamber with 4 words that changed everything. What does it cost a king to love his queen? The answer is a secret he kept until his very last breath. It begins not with a sigh of love, but with the hard, metallic clinking of coins in a counting house and the dry, endless rustle of treaty papers unrolled across tables in drafty, candlelit halls. The year is 1662. The world is a chessboard, and the principal player is King Charles II, freshly restored to a throne that had been vacant, exiled, and once, in a moment of profound, nation-shattering trauma, soaked in his own father's blood. That memory of the beheading of Charles I forged the son's soul. It left him with an ironclad resolution, never to be poor, never to be powerless, and for God's sake, never ever to be bored again. And so his gaze turned south to the coast of Portugal. His new queen, the Infanta Catherine of Braganza, was not a woman in his mind, but a transaction, a solution, a package of geopolitical power. Her dowry was staggering: 2 million golden crowns, the strategic fortress of Tangier, and 7 strange, sun-baked little islands in a distant sea called Bombay. She was the solution to his poverty and his political weakness. And yet, from the scant reports that reached him, he feared she might also be the cause of his boredom. A shy, small, devoutly Catholic princess raised in a convent who spoke not a word of English. A fair trade for a king, you might say. But here was the rub, you see. Charles Stuart was a man who traded in softer, more intoxicating currencies. The currency of a beautiful face by candlelight, the sharp coin of wit and laughter, the boundless treasury of pleasure.
I must say, their dancing is far more spirited than their politics.
A low bar, to be sure, but they clear it magnificently.
And so he built a second court, a shadow court of glitter and scandal. He didn't just have mistresses, my friends. No, a collector has items, a connoisseur has a gallery. He curated them. He assembled a living, breathing collection of femininity, each woman a testament to a different appetite. There was Barbara Palmer, the Countess of Castlemaine, a tempest of raven-haired ambition and voracious physical appetite. She was power made flesh, bearing him child after royal bastard. Her influence so brazen, she became a political force in her own right. Then came the beauties he could not quite possess, like Frances Stuart, whose face became the model for Britannia herself, who fled his grasp and became a living statue of what he could not have. And the sophisticated import, Louise de Querouaille, a sleek French kitten placed in his lap by a foreign power, a Catholic pawn in his very bed. But the greatest jewel in this tarnished crown was Nell Gwyn. She sprang not from nobility, but from the coal smoke and shouts of London's streets, a former orange seller from the pits of the theatre. Her wit was as quick and cutting as a surgeon's knife, her spirit unbroken. She knew her place in the public eye, and she weaponized it. When a mob confused her coach with that of her French rival, she flung open the curtain and shouted to the streets, "Pray, good people, be civil. I am the Protestant whore." Such was the age. Even sin had its own religious denomination, a badge to be worn in the savage theater of public opinion. And all the while, through this roaring, decadent carnival, the Queen's apartments in Whitehall Palace were a cloister of silence. No playful shouts of children echoed there, only the whisper of rosary beads and the soft, lonely tread of Catherine's feet. She endured phantom pregnancies that ended in nothing but cruel, mocking gossip. The entire kingdom watched her barrenness, while the king's illegitimate sons, his little dukes, were paraded before the court, given titles, lands, and woven into the very succession of the realm. But the cruelty wasn't always silent. Imagine the friction of the shadow court bleeding into her sanctuary. Catherine would often find herself forced to attend banquets where the king's mistresses sat in places of honor. In one infamous instance, Charles insisted on appointing his primary mistress, Barbara Palmer, as a lady of the bedchamber to the Queen.
I am the king, and I say you will be appointed Lady of the Bedchamber.
The matter is closed. As you wish, Charles.
When Catherine struck the name from the list in a rare flare of defiance, the king simply wrote it back in. During their first meeting, Catherine was so overwhelmed by the humiliation that blood gushed from her nose and she fainted before the snickering courtiers. To Charles, it was a matter of convenience. To Catherine, it was a daily crucifixion of her dignity. Even the lovable Nell Gwyn played her part in this psychological war. While Catherine knelt in her private chapel, Nell would mimic the Queen's thick Portuguese accent to make the king roar with laughter.
I tell you, these English mornings are dreadful. I demand the sunshine now.
Turning Catherine's very heritage into a punchline for the mob. Until the sport turned to bloodlust, a sinister, twisted man named Titus Oates, with a face like a conspiratorial weasel, swore he had uncovered a popish plot, a vast Catholic conspiracy to assassinate the king and burn London to the ground. And at the shadowy heart of this fantasy, the Queen herself. Catherine of Braganza, the quiet, devout woman, was now accused of plotting to poison her own husband. The lie caught fire in a tinderbox of prejudice. The mob, that many-headed beast, bayed for her blood outside the palace gates. In Parliament, men who had long despised her faith and her failure to produce an heir now stood and demanded her head, seeing in her downfall a clean Protestant succession. The private betrayal was now a public execution. The stage was set not just for her disgrace, but for her death. And here is the twist in the tapestry, the great gilded irony, glittering and sharp. The Merry Monarch, the man who had paraded his infidelities with the flair of a stage manager and humiliated his wife at every turn, now, at the 11th hour, planted his feet and stood like a weathered rock against a murderous tide. He saved her. When the politicians, hungry for a Protestant succession, the priests spewing anti-Catholic venom, and the faceless, raging mob all pointed their bony fingers at the silent, kneeling queen, he stepped in front of her. He became her shield. He faced down a parliament literally baying for a divorce, for her head, for her exile back to Portugal in disgrace, and with a voice that cut through the din, declared, "They think I have a mind for a new wife, but for all that I will not see an innocent woman abused." Consider the sheer breathtaking theater of that statement. The king, who had made a public spectacle of abusing her trust, now positioned himself as her sole chivalric protector. But why? This is the question that echoes down the corridor of history. After a lifetime of such spectacular public disregard, what prompted this sudden, unshakable fortress of fidelity? Was it a sudden, violent pang of conscience, a kingly guilt that finally pierced his cavalier heart? Or was it the cool, calculating mind of the supreme politician, the survivor, who understood that to sacrifice Catherine would be to legitimize the frenzy, to admit the fantastic popish plot had a grain of truth, and in doing so, shatter the divine authority of the crown itself? To throw her to the wolves would be to admit the wolves had a point. The question hung over the kingdom like Thames fog for years through what historians would coldly term the exclusion crisis, a brutal, grinding political war where the very soul and future of the nation was the prize. The demand from his ministers, his people, his own family was simple, logical, and brutal. Divorce the barren Catholic, set her aside, marry a fertile Protestant, secure the Stuart line. It was the reasonable, royal thing to do. And his answer, time and time again, delivered with a weary shake of his head or a flare of royal temper, was a steadfast, stubborn no.
He defied political sense. He defied dynastic duty. God will not damn me for taking a little pleasure by the way, he'd jest with that famous cynical smile, waving away the moralizers. But the deeper truth, unspoken, was far more compelling. He would not, could not, it seemed, sever the legal and spiritual bond with Catherine. There was a line, drawn in some deep, inexplicable part of his soul, that even he would not cross.
The end, when it came, was in the bitter, bone-chilling February of 1685. The king's legendary vitality, so carelessly and gloriously spent in 1,000 beds and 1,000 bottles, was finally, utterly exhausted. An apoplexy, a stroke, felled the great oak. The sprawling, chaotic rabbit warren of Whitehall Palace, that vast stage for his lifelong picaresque drama of pleasure, grew hushed. The laughter stilled, the music died. The corridors now smelled of vinegar, of pungent medicines, of cold ashes, and of a profound, waiting dread. The final act, stripped of all pageantry, was to be played out in the shadowed royal bedchamber. And in that quiet, smoky room, thick with the scent of impending mortality, the tangled threads of his scandalous life were pulled together one last time. His breath grew labored, a rattling bellows. The world of court, of power, of pleasure, receded into a gray mist. With a pragmatism that was so very him, he turned his head on the sweat-soaked pillow and whispered to his brother James a last earthly request for a mistress. Let not poor Nellie starve. A final administrative act of kindness to the woman who gave him uncomplicated laughter, who asked for no crown, only remembrance. A debt settled. But then, a movement, a presence. his clouding eyes searching the gloom past the solemn ministers, past his praying brother, found her, Catherine, sitting vigil, the woman who had given him an empire and endured a lifetime of quiet, dignified disgrace by his side. To her he summoned the dregs in his fading strength, the famous wit, the protective cynicism, the lifelong performance. It all fell away like a discarded cloak. What remained in the naked silence was neither king nor sinner, but simply a man. And to her alone he offered a simple, startling truth, uttered not for the court's ears, not for the history books, but for her soul alone. 4 words that dismantled and rebuilt the story of their entire 23-year marriage in a single breath. I have always loved you. Was it love? Perhaps not as the poets or the ballad writers define it, not a burning, exclusive, romantic flame that consumes all others. There were no sonnets bearing her name, no grand, youthful gestures of passion, but it was a loyalty of a different, deeper, more mysterious grain, a loyalty forged in the shared, silent crucible of public scrutiny and private pain, a loyalty that withstood the immense, crushing weight of crowns, the frenzied, self-righteous shouts of parliaments, and the constant, shimmering, easy allure of 100 lighter, simpler affections. He had betrayed her with a kingdom as his audience, a chorus to his infidelity. But in the end, in the sight of a god he often teased but never quite denied, and before the terrified witnesses of his deathbed, he honored her. He claimed her. However flawed, however late, however imperfect, it was a testament, a final, sober signature on a contract signed long ago in gold and tears.
He died, and with him died an era of mischief. The storms his charm had held back broke upon his brother, James. Catherine, the survivor, returned to Portugal to rule as regent. But that is a story for another night. Next time, we summon a different ghost from history, a younger, more fragile one. Catherine Howard, the 5th queen of an aging King Henry VIII. This is not a story of politics, but of a reckless heart beating in a gilded cage. It hinges on a letter, one note, passionate and foolish, written to a man who was not her king. In her own hurried script, she wrote her doom. That paper became her death warrant. Was she a naive victim surrounded by predators in silk, or a reckless player who gambled her crown and lost everything to a king's wounded pride? Her truth lies in the shadows between the lines. Like, share, subscribe. Shadow History. The past never apologized.